By 1833, the United States had emerged from the immediate crisis, but the echoes of the nullification crisis lingered. In the hearts and minds of Americans, the question remained, could the Union survive if a state defied federal authority? It was a question that would haunt every discussion of governance, tariffs, and states' rights for decades. The crisis had shown that ideology, pride, and principle could push a nation to the brink of internal conflict, even without foreign armies or external threats. It had shown that a country could almost go to war with itself and survive, but only barely. In Charleston, the memories of the crisis were fresh. Militia units that had trained for confrontation slowly disbanded, but the sense of empowerment persisted. South Carolinians felt emboldened, believing they had demonstrated the ability to influence national policy. This sense of pride was reinforced by Calhoun's writings, which circulated widely, providing intellectual justification for states' resistance to federal law. Schools, churches, and political meetings became centers for discussing the principles of sovereignty, liberty, and self-governance. Children learned that their state could stand up to Washington. Adults debated how far that power could extend. Jackson, meanwhile, returned to the routine of governance, but he remained vigilant. The president understood that while compromise had delayed conflict, it had not solved the underlying problems. He monitored political movements, economic trends, and public sentiment across the South, knowing that even a minor spark could reignite tensions. Letters to advisors and allies reveal a man consumed by the thought that the Union, once tested, would need constant defense. Jackson's vigilance was both a reflection of his personal conviction and an acknowledgment of the fragility of the system he had sworn to protect. Henry Clay's role as a great compromiser earned him respect across the nation, but he too understood the precariousness of the peace. The compromise tariff was effective in the short term, but the deeper ideological battles remained unresolved. Clay recognized that without continued negotiation and compromise, the nation would eventually face a confrontation far larger than tariffs, a confrontation that would involve not just states and federal law, but questions of morality, economy, and human freedom. The human impact of the nullification crisis extended beyond politics. Enslaved people in the South remained trapped in a system that depended on their labor, and the ideological battles of 1832 only reinforced their subjugation. Families worried about the possibility of violence and instability. Merchants and tradespeople understood that political disruption could directly affect their livelihoods. Every American, whether directly involved or not, was shaped by the crisis, learning the difficult lesson that politics is never abstract. It touches every aspect of life. Meanwhile, the broader nation watched. Northern states, with their growing industrial economies, were concerned about precedent. If South Carolina could challenge the federal government successfully, what would stop other states from doing the same? Newspapers printed editorials, opinion pieces, and letters to the editor, debating the morality and legality of nullification. The issue became a lens through which Americans examined their own beliefs about power, liberty, and governance. Calhoun's influence continued to expand, particularly in the Southern political consciousness. He became a symbol of principled resistance, a figurehead for those who feared Northern economic and political dominance. His writings articulated a vision of states' rights that was elegant, persuasive, and ultimately dangerous. The principles he championed would later provide the ideological foundation for secession and the Confederacy. In essence, the nullification crisis planted the seeds of the Civil War, decades before the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. Jackson, reflecting on the crisis in his later years, often considered the fragile nature of the Union. He had preserved the country in 1832, but he knew that future leaders would face similar challenges. In private letters, he warned that the preservation of the Union required vigilance, strength, and an unwavering commitment to the Constitution. His actions had delayed war, but they could not prevent the fundamental divides from deepening over time. The nullification crisis also revealed the importance of narrative and perception. Southern leaders framed the crisis as a defense of liberty and sovereignty. Northern leaders framed it as rebellion and treason. Ordinary Americans internalized these narratives, shaping their understanding of loyalty, patriotism, and identity. The crisis was as much about the stories people told themselves as it was about tariffs or federal authority. These narratives persisted, influencing debates over slavery, states' rights, and federal power for decades. As the nation expanded westward, the tensions exposed by the crisis became increasingly pronounced. New territories were acquired, and questions arose about whether slavery would be permitted in these new regions. Each decision carried the weight of precedent, and the ideological battles of 1832 informed the debates. The nullification crisis had shown that when principles collide, the consequences are far-reaching. Economic policies, cultural identity, and moral beliefs were intertwined, and compromise, while possible, was always fragile. For Americans living during and after crisis, the lesson was clear. Leadership, courage, and compromise were essential, but even they could not fully resolve deep ideological divides. Jackson's decisive action demonstrated the power of the presidency. Clay's negotiation illustrated the importance of diplomacy. Calhoun's advocacy highlighted the enduring power of ideas. Together, these men shaped the nation's response, setting examples that will be studied and debated for generations. Even today, historians consider the nullification crisis a pivotal moment in American history. It was the first time a state openly challenged federal authority, and it exposed the fragile nature of the Union. It revealed the tensions inherent in balancing state sovereignty with national unity. It demonstrated that while compromise could avert immediate conflict, unresolved issues could fester, grow, and ultimately lead to war. And yet, the crisis also reminds us that history is shaped by human decisions. The courage of leaders, the foresight of negotiators, and the determination of ordinary citizens all played a role. The nullification crisis was not inevitable. It was a test, a challenge, and a warning. The nation survived because key individuals acted decisively, because ideas were negotiated, and because the people of South Carolina and the nation as a whole understood, at least temporarily, the value of peace over pride. The lessons of 1832 extend far beyond tariffs and legislation. They speak to the fragility of democracy, the dangers of ideological rigidity, and the power of human agency. They remind us that a nation is not only built on laws and constitutions, but on the choices of its people, the strength of its leaders, and the willingness of citizens to. As the 1830s progressed, the echoes of the nullification crisis could be felt across the entire United States. Though the immediate danger had passed, the ideological rifts it revealed were growing wider. Citizens, leaders, and states were beginning to realize that the balance between state authority and federal power was not a fixed line, but tension that required constant negotiation. The nation had faced its first serious test, and while it had survived, the warning was clear. Internal division could be as threatening as any foreign enemy. In South Carolina, the sense of empowerment persisted. Citizens celebrated their ability to influence federal policy without bloodshed, but the lessons of compromise were tempered by a lingering sense of distrust. Political clubs, town meetings, and newspapers became forums for debating the proper role of the federal government and the rights of states. Every tariff, law, or federal initiative was scrutinized through the lens of 1832, reminding the people that the federal government could be challenged and that vigilance was necessary to protect their interests. Andrew Jackson, now a symbol of strong executive leadership, continued to define the presidency for the nation. His willingness to confront a defiant state established the precedent that the Union could not be negotiated away lightly. Jackson's actions demonstrated that the executive branch could act decisively to preserve national unity, and his determination became a reference point for future presidents. Yet even Jackson recognized the limits of power. He understood that while force could enforce law, it could not heal ideological divisions. The true work of preserving the Union required negotiation, diplomacy, and the careful management of public opinion. John C. Calhoun's ideas, meanwhile, gained a life of their own. His doctrine of states' rights was not merely theoretical. It became a political strategy that shaped Southern identity for decades. Leaders across the South cited Calhoun as a moral authority, arguing that states could resist federal policies that threatened their economic or cultural foundations. Calhoun had succeeded in embedding the principles of nullification deeply into Southern political consciousness, creating a lasting framework for resistance that would influence debates over slavery, tariffs, and federal authority for years to come. Henry Clay's contribution, while often quieter, remained essential. His ability to negotiate a peaceful resolution to a potentially explosive conflict demonstrated the power of pragmatism in politics. Clay's compromise preserved the Union, allowed South Carolina to save face, and prevented bloodshed, but it also highlighted the fragile nature of political solutions. While compromise could delay conflict, it could not eliminate deep-seated differences. Clay's work became a blueprint for future leaders facing sectional tensions, illustrating the delicate balance between principle and practicality in governance. The human impact of the nullification crisis continued to resonate. Farmers, merchants, and ordinary citizens experienced the economic and social consequences of political conflict. Higher tariffs affected trade, local economies, and family livelihoods. Enslaved people remained caught in the crossfire of ideological debates, their lives overshadowed by the threat of political upheaval. Communities learned that national disputes could affect daily existence in profound ways, and the crisis instilled a heightened awareness of the stakes inherent in political decision-making. The media played a crucial role in shaping public perception. Newspapers and pamphlets across the country framed the crisis in starkly different terms. Southern papers praised nullification as a righteous assertion of liberty and sovereignty. Northern papers condemned it as treason and a threat to the Union. These competing narratives reinforced regional identities, hardened ideological positions, and ensured that the memory of the crisis would persist in public consciousness. The power of story, of framing rhetoric and narrative, became evident, showing how perception could shape politics as much as policy itself. In the years that followed, the nullification crisis influenced national politics in profound ways. It became a reference point for debates about federal authority, the rights of states, and the potential for disunion. Politicians across the spectrum used it to justify positions on slavery, trade, and governance. The crisis had demonstrated that even a young nation could be tested internally, and that the principles of federalism required constant attention, negotiation, and enforcement. The economic disparities between North and South, first highlighted during the crisis, continued to widen. Northern industrial growth contrasted sharply with Southern dependence on agriculture and slave labor. These differences fueled political tensions, creating fertile ground for future conflicts. Citizens began to see themselves not only as Americans, but as members of distinct regional economies and cultures. The nullification crisis had shown that these regional differences were not just theoretical. They had the power to influence national policy and threaten the cohesion of the Union. Jackson's decisive leadership, Calhoun's ideological vision, and Clay's diplomatic skill together illustrated the complex interplay between personality, principle, and circumstance in shaping history. Each man acted according to his beliefs, yet their combined actions had consequences far beyond their intentions. The crisis revealed that the survival of a nation depends not only on laws and constitutions, but also on the judgment, courage, and negotiation skills of those entrusted with power. The nullification crisis also foreshadowed the sectional conflicts that would dominate American politics in the mid-19th century. Debates over tariffs, states' rights, and federal authority were closely tied to the issue of slavery. The ideological battles of 1832 were a precursor to the secessionist movements that would eventually lead to the Civil War. The crisis had shown that even without immediate violence, unresolved tensions could grow, metastasize, and threaten national unity decades later. In reflecting on the crisis, it becomes clear that the stakes were far higher than economic policy. The nullification crisis was a test of the American experiment itself, a measure of whether a diverse, young nation could survive internal dissent, ideological disputes, and the competing demands of liberty and unity. It demonstrated that governance requires more than law. It requires leadership courage and the ability to navigate human ambition and pride. Even today, the lessons of the nullification crisis remain relevant. It reminds us that democracy is fragile, that ideological and regional differences can escalate into existential threats, and that leadership, negotiation, and compromise are essential to preserving national unity. The crisis teaches that the survival of a nation depends not only on institutions and laws, but on the choices, judgment, and courage of its leaders and citizens alike.